Distinguished Professor Jackie Eccles, grateful that you made time today to come and talk a little bit about your work. A place to start might be what originally motivated you, if you don't mind me using the word, to become an educational researcher.
I think I've always been interested in two things. One, individual differences, why people are doing different things, and the role that education and family environments play in shaping those individual differences. So, and I was also always interested in gender issues, and when you think about those things together, they sort of coalesce around educational psychology.
And was it the case your family was particularly supportive of your direction and pursuit here, or?
No, I'm a first-generation college student. My father was in the military, and we traveled all over the world. So I think that fed into my interest in individual differences, because I got to see so many different ways of being in the world as I was growing up. We lived in Japan, we lived in Okinawa, we lived in Germany, we lived in several places in the United States. They didn't understand what it was to go to college. They clearly wanted the best for their daughters, my sister and I, but they would, I think, preferred that we stayed home and married young and weren't too far away.
And I started off with the question, what motivated you to this career path? Is that the right way to think about it? Individual motivations in terms of?
Well, that's certainly one of the things I study. I mean, I study why people do what they do, and a big part of that is trying to understand how they make choices about careers and college majors and educational attainment, and what they actually want to do with big chunks of their lives as they look into the future. I certainly believe that motivation is probably the most important determinant of those decisions. And it's also a very useful theoretical term for explaining what I do, so yes.
And you're known for a theory of motivation. What sort of factors come into play with that?
Yes, I'm known for the expectancy value theory, sometimes called the contemporary expectancy value theory of motivation. It's really based in a very classical approach to understanding human behavior that has been popular in economics and business, in education for long periods, for the last couple of centuries. And basically, the theory hypothesizes that people will do things if they think they can succeed at them. They're unlikely to do things if they're going to fail, if they think they're going to fail. And given that they think they can succeed, they will pick the things that are of the most value to them. And value turns out to be a very complicated notion because what gives tasks value to individuals? Certainly the economists will talk about, well, money gives something value, so someone will do something because it's a way of earning an income, and things that will earn you more income will be more valuable to you than things that earn less. But that's not the only, nor for many people the most important. Others would be that activities give you a chance to show the world who you are. So this was where it links most closely to what we would call identities. And if I think that I'm a kind person, then activities that allow me to be kind will have high value to me, because that lets me prove to myself that I'm kind, prove to others that I'm kind, and also sets off the reward firing mechanisms in my brain that I'm doing this thing that I presumably care about. So that would be another kind of value. Doing the things that are linked to what your family wants for you, or what you need to do for your children or for your community. All of these are influences on how valuable any given task would be. And of course, what people have to do is they have to pick which tasks they're going to take. They may not do this consciously, but they're of course doing it all the time. I'm sitting here with you now. I made a decision to do that. I'm not going to get up and walk away. That's a choice. even if it's a foregone conclusion. I didn't debate it once I said I was going to do it. I just am doing it. But it is a choice, and I'm not doing a lot of other things as a consequence. So the value that I have for this task versus all of the other things that I could be doing is what's likely to control my behavior, influence my behavior. And this becomes even more important when you think about things like careers. I mean, something that if you make a commitment to it, it's not just am I going to do this on Friday afternoon, but am I going to do this for the rest of my life? If I'm going to marry this person, I mean, that's a commitment that requires much more top-down decision making, but it actually operates on these same principles, that we do those things that have high value to us.
This also probably applies not just to choice of careers, but choice of engagement in smaller tasks. So, for example, whether or not a student will focus on studying and working hard for a particular class. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's, I mean, one of the things, when you talk about a student studying for a class, it becomes easy for us to talk about what are the distractors. And in my theoretical language, I would call that the costs. So what else could you be doing, and what do you give up by studying? I mean, we know that if a student does study, they might do that because studying is important to them. They want to be seen as a good student. They want to get a good grade in this class because it fulfills an obligation that they have or furthers their goals. But I think a big factor that will go into a student's decision as to whether to study tonight or tomorrow will be what else is around. And if my friends come in and say, let's go out and party, then the cost of studying goes way up, and an individual might in fact say, no, I'm not going to study tonight, I'm going to go do this other thing instead. And that's a really nice example of how when you're making these decisions, whether you do it consciously or not, it's very contextualized, and it's very based on what's going on in your life at this moment in time.
And you could also apply this theory to vexing problems in society. I know you've been engaged in the study of the question around women in STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and math careers. How is your work in that area tied back to this theory?
Well, it turns out this theory has been a very important theory in a lot of people's thinking about that particular question, why girls don't go on in math. And it's interesting for several reasons. First, people just assumed that the girls didn't go into math because they lacked confidence in their ability in mathematics. In other words, they were less than boys. So it had to be something that was driving them away from math or STEM-related careers. And so we needed to understand what the deficit was. So a lot of studies went on, well, girls lack confidence in math. That must be why they're not going on into STEM. Let's do interventions to try to make them have more confidence in their math ability. And while that's it is the case that people who lack confidence don't go in math and their math skills don't go on in STEM. But it turns out that's not the reason why women didn't go into STEM. And it wasn't until people like me, and there are several of us, said, well, wait a minute, maybe we should talk to the women. Maybe we should, if you think of it as a choice, we better go find out, well, why do they think they didn't go into math? It isn't that they didn't go into math and did nothing else. They did something. It just didn't happen to be STEM. And so we did a lot of talking, and it turned out that a lot of the women said, well, I don't want to, it wasn't math per se at all. It was, well, I don't want to be an engineer. That was the thing that most of the people who had, when we talked about women not going into STEM, it was really in engineering and in computer science now, and to some extent in the physical sciences, physics and chemistry. It's never has been true in the biological sciences. It never has been true in education, in the sense of who became teachers of math and science. In some ways, the whole idea of why women didn't go into STEM was because we didn't call teaching STEM STEM. So they didn't get counted in the census. So we said, well, women weren't going into STEM because we didn't count going into teaching STEM as part of going into STEM. That, of course, has changed now, and so it's not looking as different. But anyway, as we began to go in, the women said, I don't want to go into engineering because I want to do something that will help people. And I can't imagine being an engineer will actually help people. And then we said, well, what if you worked on artificial limbs? Wouldn't that help somebody? And they said, well, yeah, that would. Is that what engineers do? And I said, well, some engineers do that. So we began to probe more and more into this, and what it turned out was that women in America really didn't have a good idea of what engineers do. Nobody bothered to tell either boys or girls what engineers do. And the women were just at a very young age, so already by the 7th grade, were ruling out those occupations. It was more that they never even thought about those occupations because they saw no link between those occupations and what they wanted to do with their lives. And so they did other things. They became teachers. They planned on becoming wives and mothers. Now, women, by and large, if they want to become a wife and mother, they still want to have a career, but that's new. That's within the last 30 years that's been typical. But even if they did want to have a career, they didn't think about the careers that were engineering. And so probably another very good example of that is what we're finding is that women are equally likely, so high-achieving women are equally likely to place value on mathematics and on English. And when they actually go to make their career choices, they're much more likely to be influenced by the things that are related to their language skills than to their mathematical skills. So they could see a closer link between what they wanted to do with their lives and their language skills than their mathematical skills. And so it was really the high confidence they had in English and the high desire to help other people that was driving them out of the sciences, not a lack of confidence in their ability to succeed in those professions.
And speak a little bit about the boys as the comparison case.
Well, the boys, several interesting things are going on. First, boys are less likely. High-achieving boys are less likely to achieve equally across the board. So having someone who has both high competence and high confidence in math and reading is much less likely for a boy child than for a girl child. So in some ways, you could turn the question around and say, why aren't boys going into these other fields? They were much more likely, if they had high math skills, to be directed into going into engineering or into chemistry or into physics, whereas girls were given more options, and they saw more options. Now, they weren't given adequate information about engineering, so I don't want to downplay the fact that many of them might have loved being an engineer. They just didn't know anything about it, whereas people were more likely to tell a boy who had high math skills, well, you should think about becoming an engineer. Now, one of the interesting things about this in terms of recruiting more people into engineering, and I have been making this case as I talk to schools of engineering, is they will probably have better luck by trying to get out the message of what engineers actually do than trying to convince girls they're better in math than they think they are. That will be a more effective strategy for recruiting all kinds of people into engineering, that we really don't do a very good job of telling people what engineers do. So if our goal as a society is to get more people in engineering, then we better do a better job telling people why they want to be an engineer, what they can do as an engineer, so that they don't just go off their stereotypes. But the other thing, in terms of both boys and girls, I think we have to do a better job in both cases of letting them know there's a range of options. So the boys were limiting their options, in some ways unnecessarily so, and the girls were not thinking about an option like engineering, but in fact were feeling like they were making choices to go into fields they would love more so than the boys were. The boys, I think, were feeling much more like they were being pressured to go into engineering, whereas we were leaving girls a bit more on their own to make the choice, and therefore high math ability girls made a much wider range of choices about what to do with their lives.
And do you think this is part of a bigger problem, not just engineering, but the lack of information about careers is
Absolutely.
broader?
Absolutely. I mean, we we live in a society that highly values individual choice and individualism. And we increasingly, over the last 50 years, have told young people that they should find a job they think they will love, they should train themselves to go into it, and they should go into it. And that's all we tell them. We don't tell them where to go to find out what jobs do. We don't tell them how they're going to know whether they would love a job or not. Most of them get this information from the media. And so they watch television. What jobs do they see on television? Well, in the sciences, they see investigators, so criminal investigators. They see medical doctors, and that's about it. So they either, if they think about science, they think about being a medical doctor, or they have some image in their head of Einstein. I mean, if you ask kids to draw scientists, they will inevitably draw an image of Einstein. So a man in front of a blackboard with lots of numbers on it, and his hair, you know, all sticking out. And sometimes he has a pipe. I don't know where the pipe image came from, but that's often there. And a Bunsen burner over at the side burning. That's the image they have. And unless we change those images, we're leaving them very poorly equipped to make this very important choice in their lives. So I would argue the one thing that the schools desperately need to do is to develop some very sophisticated, engaging career guidance, and start it from early on and take it all the way through, sort of cycling at an age-appropriate level as kids go through elementary school and into junior high school and into high school, information about different occupations.
You know, at UC Irvine, you're involved in an experimental intervention in physics and chemistry around some of these issues. Right. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, so we have a lot of students who come and major in STEM, in physics and chemistry. Anyone majoring in any science, whether they're going to go on into medicine or into engineering or into IT, they take physics and chemistry as sort of the first step in. But many of them, they've just been told to do that. They don't necessarily know why they're doing that. And we know that the dropout rate is quite high. So they take that first course and they decide not to go on after that. So we took this idea of the value of the task for individuals. Could we make that more salient in the courses? And so we are running a study where half of the students, as part of their regular assignments in their introductory physics and chemistry course, have to think about what they learned in the last week and write about how it's relevant to them, how it's relevant to their lives, how it's relevant to what they might want to do in the future, and how they would tell that to somebody else. So we have them do this repeatedly over the 2 semesters of the intro courses. And sometimes they write it as just an essay to the instructor. I mean, this is a regular assignment in the class. And sometimes they're asked to write it as a letter to a friend, or a letter to the newspaper, or a letter to their parents. And what we're finding in other places, so not at UCI, but at the University of Wisconsin, is that's reducing the dropout. That's making more of the students who had doubts about whether or not they wanted to stay in this major, going on and taking the next course, and then actually going on and majoring in the field. We're hoping this will be even more effective here at Irvine, because in Wisconsin it was most effective with first-generation students, but they had only about 10% first-generation students, whereas we at UCI, a little over 50% of our undergraduate population are first-generation students, and it's looking like this group of students have a particularly hard time when they get into introductory chemistry or physics, understanding what is this good for? Why am I taking this course? And this helps, of course, for them to think that through themselves. We're also then trying to get the professors to talk more about it. So it not only becomes something the students think about, but as part of what they're actually hearing in their classes, is more about why they want to know this as opposed to just facts that they're required to learn.
Some of my own research has looked at college students and found about a third of them with bare minimum engagement in full-time college students on college campuses, only about an hour of studying a day. What would you advise a provost to do confronting this problem, not here at UC Irvine, but in higher ed more broadly?
I actually had a conversation with our class yesterday about that in class, because many of them are not, appear to be minimally interested and engaged.
And we're co-teaching a pilot course for the first time this year with Professor Greg Duncan, an economist, and Professor Joan Malczewski, an historian.
Right. And well, I asked them, you know, why. I asked it in a couple of ways. I said, why are you taking this course? And then I said, now think about those students who are highly engaged and those who are not. Why are the disengaged students disengaged, and why are the highly motivated students engaged? And then I said, what would you do to motivate the disengaged students? Got very interesting answers. But one of them brought up the point of, look, we're not all going to be in here motivated for this classroom in the way that you would like to see us motivated. Isn't that okay? We have different reasons for being in here. And I had to stop and think about that. You know, yes, that's probably true. We're in a society that tells them they all need to go to college, and not that they need to go to college because it's important to learn how to think or to be immersed in an intellectual environment for a while, for a community of learners. We tell them it's because they need it to get a job, they need it to, you know, for all these extrinsic reasons, which are important. You do need to get a job. So I was wondering whether the provosts ought to think more about, or leaders, we ought to be thinking more about providing multiple different avenues to meet these different goals. So rather than having 150 kids with different goals in the same class, maybe we should offer that same class online to those who only want to be partially involved and want to only come away at a C level of competence. And a different kind of class for those that they think this is really, they really love the material, they really want to think about it, and it would be a smaller group and we could do all kinds of other things with that group. So maybe we should be thinking more about diversifying the way we offer higher education and K-12 education in a way that meets different goals. I mean, I worry a lot about selling higher ed as a way to get a job. And I think we've fallen into that crack. We know that you can make more if you go to college, so go to college so you'll make more. Well, if that's the reason they're coming to college, then it's not a surprise they sit in class board.
And also the, both kind of the college for all, but in addition, the moving away in the past few decades from grouping by ability and interest to not being willing to have those kind of conversations and those kind of programmatic differentiation in schools has had some negative consequences potentially.
Yeah.
What's left to be done for a new student coming into education interested in motivation?
Well, there's several new and exciting techniques that are available right now that will help us get at motivation in the wild. So typically when we study motivation, we either intervene in a way that we think will influence their motivation, but we're not really measuring their motivation, or we use self-reports. How much do you like this? How motivated were you? This kind of thing. Well, people aren't necessarily very good at identifying that. I mean, this motivation is something that happens on the fly. So we haven't been able to actually study motivation. We've been able to study people's theories of their own motivation, and we've been able to study tweaks in the environment that we think influence behavior through motivation, and then we see the behavioral consequences. We now have ways that we can actually be monitoring what people are doing on a much more moment-to-moment basis. Certainly the Apple and Google are doing this and trying to decide what advertisements to give to us. We can use that in the laboratories now and in studies, scientific studies. So one of the things that I'm having students begin to do more of is what we call experience sampling method, ESM. And what you do with ESM is you have people carry around a beeper or their phone, and it beeps randomly at various times in the day. They go for 2 minutes onto their phone, and we ask them a series of questions about where they are, who they're with, what they're doing, and then a set of questions about how they're feeling. Now, again, that's self-report, but it's in the moment. So you sort of stop them and you take a snapshot and say, all right, now, are you happy right now? Are you excited? Are you anxious? Do you wish you were somewhere else? And we can do that like several times in the day over many days. And we can do it you would go in and do it for a couple of weeks, and then you'd wait, and you go in and do it again in a couple months later, and hopefully we will actually be able to see something like interest grow, and we can begin to think about, well, what's going on in their lives that is making them interested, and we can actually begin to see something like interest and motivation begin to grow. We've also now got studies where we can go into the brain, and don't go into the brain, we picture the brain, and we can actually see what's going on in their mind, and we can see the reward system work, and see why it does feel good to do this, and why is it the case that people who end up becoming engineers get a spurt of rewards hormones in their brain every time they do a math problem. That's a much better understanding of what the mechanisms actually are. What does fatigue actually do to you? Why is it harder to learn when you're fatigued? Why is it easier to learn when you're happy, when you're motivated? Why is it easier to learn when you're talking to somebody? I mean, what's going on in those situations? So the technologies that have come online in the last 10 years have just opened up this particular field tremendously. And it is a wonderful time to be getting into it and beginning to study it. So I would love to be a graduate student starting over again with the technologies we have now to ask these kinds of questions.
Yeah, and the technology also around how education is delivered and experienced and captured.
Oh, absolutely. I think as we see the shift from things that are going on in classrooms to things that are going on online, there's going to be huge debates about what the motivational consequences or opportunities and barriers are in those different formats, and how can we increase the motivation in one or decrease the constraints. So for example, I've been working some with Mark Warshauser, another faculty member here, on what do you want to put into an online learning program that will actually get the students more motivated to participate to the end of that program, because that's another case where dropout is huge. They start and then they just don't want to keep doing it. And what we're finding is things like that we know are motivating from classrooms, the opportunity to have conversations with others. So if you can build in opportunities to actually form a group, to have conversations as part of the course, you will change people's interest in staying in that course to the end. And we will have these opportunities. Now we're just beginning to be thinking about how you design these online courses or learning experiences in a way that maximally takes advantage of what we know about the motivational systems. The same is true in classrooms. I mean, classrooms are going to become more individualized, so you're going to have the opportunity to perhaps find a much better match between what the child wants to learn and what the school is going to provide for them. So we're going to have chances to study that. I mean, what does an individualized classroom really look like? What does a K-12 school system looks like that takes motivation seriously? And now that we've got the abilities to individualize instruction, we can actually begin to open those doors up. And so I think the opportunity to sort of build what we know at the individual level about what motivation looks like and how you would apply that to learning situations is just wide open.
You mentioned the changing technology a few times in this description of work to be done in the future. If you're giving concrete advice to a doctoral student, would you advise not just looking at these kind of topics, but also attempting to master these new competencies around looking at new forms of data,
Oh, absolutely. I think if they don't, they will be very ill-served when they leave here. And one of the other things that's exciting, I think, about our program is we have lots of different expertise on methodologies, in part because of the interdisciplinary nature, but because of the number of people who have been attracted and have come in, and we've got people who are doing a very exciting things in using all kinds of different approaches.
So, concrete advice to doctoral students: think about technology and new ways of measuring. You mentioned also training in larger research teams, apprenticeships and internships being important.
Yes, that'd be important.
And speak more to that.
I have always been a collaborative researcher, so I have always run a big team. I can't imagine doing research in any other way. And I think that is more true now than it was before, because the problems that we're trying to understand are so difficult and complex. No one mind is going to be able to wrap itself around it to do something that's really important. And I think the opportunity to hear different points of view is where the new knowledge is going to come from. It's going to come from the interfaces at these boundaries between different disciplines. I would encourage the students to work with different groups, work with different faculty, go to different. We have a tradition here at the School of Education of having lab groups, and typically one or two faculty members will share a lab group or run it singly. I would encourage students to attend 2 or 3 of those. Don't just get locked into one and one perspective. Go present your work in other groups. Listen to what they have to present. Always be thinking about how is what they're saying relevant to what I'm thinking about, and it always will be. I mean, there's very unlikely that they won't hear something that has some relevance to what they're interested in.
So doctoral students also should be looking at multiple disciplines while they're training.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd like to thank you again for making time to come here and share your thoughts with this larger audience. I'm very grateful for your presence here as a colleague, and again for your time this afternoon.
I'm happy to do it. I'm honored.